What is going on, Solo fam? My name is John Solo, this is Messed Up Origins, and today we're breaking down another classic fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. You know, we've covered quite a few Andersen stories in this series so far. The Little Mermaid, the Snow Queen, the Ugly Duckling, and the Princess and the Pea, to name a few. And while those are all unique stories in their own right, today's story, the Tinderbox, is straight up weird. Don't get me wrong, it's a good weird, especially if you're a fan of gratuitous and violent murder, but there's definitely going to be a few moments in this story that come as a shock to ya. Not only because of what happens in it, but also how similar it is to two other stories we've covered on this channel before, Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Don't worry, if you haven't watched those episodes yet, well, first off, shame on you, but also I'll break down all the connections and commonalities in this episode so you don't feel clueless while you're watching. And now, Solo Tribe, it's time we get started. Don't forget to give that like button a soothing back rub that might just get you reported to HR, and subscribe to have new episodes of Messed Up Origins delivered to your sub box on a regular basis. So if you're like me and never read the Tinderbox as a kid, you probably don't know very much about it, and that's a shame because its backstory is pretty interesting. To start, it was the very first children's story Hans Christian Andersen ever published. You might recall me mentioning in my Princess and the Pea breakdown that it was the first of 4 stories included in his first collection, Tales Told for Children, which was printed on May 8, 1835. Also, despite many of Andersen's stories being treasured by readers all over the world nowadays, they were not well received by critics. Back then, they just didn't appreciate his casual writing style and that none of his tales had a clear-cut moral. Of course, this fact didn't stop literature scholars decades later from overanalyzing every single word the man wrote in search for a deeper meaning, but more on that in a bit. The reason I wanted to mention those critiques is that in my opinion, the Tinderbox perfectly exemplifies the critics' problems with Andersen's writing, even more so than any of his other stories we've talked about. So as I break it down, I want you to pay close attention to how unusual this story is compared to the typical fairy tale, as well as how many similarities it has with Aladdin and Ali Baba. Now, our adventure starts with a soldier returning home from war when he's stopped in his path by an ugly old witch. The witch compliments him, saying how impressive it is that he's a soldier, and tells him that now he'll become very rich. Kind of a weird thing to say to a stranger, but she clarifies. She points to a nearby tree and says there's a hidden chamber beneath it where he'll find 3 rooms, each with a chest containing copper, silver, or gold. Knowing that she isn't doing this out of the kindness of her heart, the soldier says, "Yeah? What's in it for you?" And she asks him to fetch her a little tinderbox that's also in one of the chambers. For those who don't know, a tinderbox contains tinder, flint, steel, and other items used to start fires. The soldier climbs up the tree, enters the opening at the very top, and slides down the hollow trunk into the chamber below. The events in the chamber follow the rule of 3. He goes into the first room, finds a dog with eyes as big as teacups sitting on the chest, and per the witch's instructions, he places the dog on her apron that he laid out on the ground and fills his knapsack with copper. In the next room, he does the same thing, but the dog's eyes are as big as mill wheels and the chest is filled with silver, so he dumps out his bag of copper and refills it. In the third and final room, it's the same scenario, but the dog's eyes are as big as the Copenhagen Tower, a very large observatory, and the chest is filled with gold. Don't ask me why he kept emptying and refilling his knapsack when he knew going into the chamber that there was a chest filled with gold. I guess he just got caught up in the moment or something, because the witch actually had to call down and remind him to get the tinderbox before he came back up. And that was like one of the 2 things he had to do down there. So when he returns to the surface, the witch asks him to give her the tinderbox, and he says, "Not until you tell me why you want it." The witch refuses to say anything because that wasn't part of the deal, and in response, the soldier takes out his sword and cuts off her head. Like I said, gratuitous and violent murder, but we're just getting started. Now that the soldier's basically hit the jackpot, he goes on to blow his winnings on everything under the sun. He gets a new wardrobe, eats delicious foods, buys a big house, makes all kinds of new yuppie friends, and even gives some money away to the poor. His newfound riches buy him everything he wants except for some time with the beautiful princess, who the king has forced to live alone in a copper castle because the prophecy states that she'll marry a common foot soldier and he doesn't want that to happen. You know, because he's a pretentious dick. The story moves forward, and because he didn't do any bookkeeping, the soldier spends all of his newfound money pretty quickly. And his newfound friends, who once enjoyed his riches with him, stopped coming over because they had to climb too many stairs to get to his house, and it was no longer worth it. One night, when the soldier didn't even have a penny to buy a candle, he remembered there was a piece of candle stuck in the tinderbox. But just after he struck a few sparks from the flint and steel, his front door flew open, and there sat the dog with eyes as big as teacups. The dog said to him, "What are your orders, master?" And he soon realized realized he could summon the dogs to help him do anything he wanted. So he basically found a Mr. Meeseeks box. At first, he had them bring all the copper, silver, and gold he desired, but late one night, he tells one to bring him the princess, and soon enough, the dog returns with her sleeping on his back. The soldier found her to be the most beautiful gal he'd ever seen and kissed her, which is a little creepy. Cut to the next morning when the princess is eating breakfast with her parents and tells them about the strange dream she had last night involving the soldier. The parents wanted to make sure this was actually a dream, so they had one of the old ladies of the court watch the princess that night and follow her to the soldier's house. The old lady then marked the door with a cross so she could show the king and queen where it was. However, the soldier was a quick thinker, and the next morning he marked all of his neighbors' doors with crosses before they could arrest him. Remind you of anyone in particular? Fortunately for them, the queen had another idea. She took her large gold scissors, cut a piece of silk into squares, and made a neat little bag. This bag she filled with buckwheat flour and tied it round the princess's neck, and then she cut a small hole in the bag so that the flour might be scattered on the ground as the princess went along. Well, this plan did the trick, so the next morning they followed the trail to the soldier's house, arrested him, and sentenced him to hang. The worst part? It was a Monday morning. Imagine being ready to start your week off on the right foot and you're sentenced to death as soon as your alarm goes off. I actually made that detail up, but just imagine. It would suck. The worst part about the situation actually was that the soldier didn't have his tinderbox, so he had no way to get himself out of trouble. That is, until he saw from his jail cell window a little boy running to the gallows to watch his upcoming execution. He beckoned the boy over and promised him 4 whole coppers if he ran to his house and brought him his tinderbox, so he did. Now fast forward to when the soldier's standing on the gallows waiting to be hung. Just before they put the rope around his neck, he asks the king if he can smoke one last pipe before his execution, and the king grants his request, only to regret it immediately. The soldier taps on his tinderbox, summons the 3 dogs, and commands them to rescue him. What ensues is a total massacre. The magic hounds use their razor-sharp fangs to grab hold of the judge's legs, arms, and faces and proceed to throw them so high into the air that when they land, their bodies break into pieces. The king then starts freaking out and begging for his life, but the soldier sticks the dogs on him and the queen as well, killing them in the same way. Naturally, the villagers are terrified of the soldier and his merciless helper, so to appease him, they nominate him to be their king. He accepts the nomination, goes on to marry the beautiful princess, who apparently had no problem that he brutally murdered her parents, and they lived happily ever after. Now before we get into what message Andersen could have possibly been trying to convey with that story, I want to talk about where the tale comes from, because like I said, he took inspiration from multiple sources. At its core, the Tinderbox is a reimagining of an older Scandinavian tale, The Spirit in the Candle, which Andersen loved as a kid. That story follows a soldier who obtains riches after an old woman asks him to get a candle from a sleeping troll. In this version, he also refuses to hand the magic item over, lights it, and finds out it summons a magic servant who will follow his every order. One of these orders is to set up meetings with the beautiful princess, which happen the same way they do in the Tinderbox. The soldier is also busted in a similar way and sentenced to burn at the stake for his crimes, but he's saved at the last minute when he's allowed to light his pipe one final time and uses the candle to summon his henchmen to save him. So as you can see, those stories are nearly identical, with only little details like the magic item, the kind of henchman, and the method of execution being changed. But it also shares similarities with both Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, the 2 additional stories added to the original 1001 Arabian Nights collection, which just so happened to be a favorite of Andersen's childhood. In Ali Baba, the antagonists are also unsuccessful in their attempts to find their target's house because his slave marks all the doors on his street with X's, confusing them. And then in Aladdin, you've got the mortal man who's made powerful by the supernatural after helping a mysterious figure and then refuses to give that figure the item they sought. Also like Aladdin, the soldier goes through 3 chambers, a detail that's not featured in Spirit of the Candle, and then there's the princess who's first brought to him when she's sleeping and goes on to marry him in the end. These similarities result in each of these stories fitting in various tale types under the Arne Thompson category Magic Objects, which contains dozens of fairy tales from all over the world, as well as some more modern stories. Real talk, I've got to believe that's where Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon came up with the Mr. Meeseeks storyline. You've got a magic object that summons a mysterious, blue-skinned helper whose only purpose is to help you fulfill your desires. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? As we've discussed in previous episodes, Andersen's childhood, which was full of abuse, rejection, and humiliation on a regular basis, had significant influence over his writing. His frustration with his broken family, his low socioeconomic status, and the other challenges of the unfortunate circumstances he was born into manifested itself in his work. Biographer Jackie Wullschalger notes that the fairy tale was a form in which Andersen could express forbidden emotions and thoughts without, as it were, being caught. It's no accident that of the first 3 folktales he chose to adapt, 2 are fantasies of social revenge. And let's not forget about The Ugly Duckling, which he referred to as his autobiography. The style draws the teller and listener together, sharing jokes against the pompous and powerful, engaging in cunning tricks that allow the poor and weak to triumph, and providing an outlet for Andersen's rage against the bourgeois society that tried to make him conform. Also, when you take into account that Andersen was still dirt poor when he wrote this story and angry about that fact, it's easier to pick up on the tale's underlying metaphors. Folklorist Jack Sipes believed the soldier represented Andersen, the witch represented his mother, and the king and queen represented the Danish nobility, which is especially dark when you consider the fates of these characters. But what I think is fascinating is when you take the metaphor a step further and say the tinderbox represents potential and opportunity. To me, the soldier getting the tinderbox himself, killing the witch when she asks for it, and using the object for his own benefit could represent Andersen's view of his own life. While his mother provided the means for him to get by for a short while, she refused to give him any guidance after. So he left, and it was up to him to figure out how to use his potential to get by in the world and reach a status he could be proud of. Now keep in mind, there's no guarantee that any of these analyses are correct, and I may very well be talking out of my but we know from Andersen himself that he often used his own life to personalize his adaptations of his beloved childhood stories, so I think we're onto something. Anyway, Solo fam, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Messed Up Origins. Make sure to leave your thoughts on the story, its inspiration, and any suggestions for future episodes in a comment down below. Don't forget to also hit that like button to show your support and help us reach our goal of whatever pathetically low number of likes I chose for today, and subscribe to have more messed up content delivered to your sub box on a regular basis. Make sure to follow me on social media too. That way you'll get regular updates about what I'm up to between videos, what content is coming up next, and you'll have a more direct way to reach me outside of the comment section. I'll be seeing you guys soon with another episode of Messed Up Origins. Until then, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first.